Welcome to the audio check. Do 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 do. Sounds good to me. Take a Same as yesterday, thank you. For those of us who only took one class with me. And hey, yesterday it started out terrible. I had that microphone first. Then it fixed itself. Well, if only one person wants me to turn it up, I'll let you use your own volume slider. Gonna have some tiny font today, so if you haven't already, click that gearbox and make sure you're streaming in 2K, because I didn't bother making slides for most of the syllabus. It's gonna be real small. We still have a minute left, but hey, thanks for coming to the audio check. Audio check? Auto check? Check, check, check. If you're coming from Canvas, make sure you join the Discord, but I think got pretty much everybody in Discord already. Although, I don't know, it's 22 online. I think we have 30 in the class, so maybe missing a few faces. The syllabus that you see here is available on Canvas. Look in the files. It's the only thing there right now, I think, if you want to follow along without having to read the teeny-weeny font. Teeny-weeny-weeny. All right, 3:30, it's official. Let's get started. Welcome to CS360. This is the game design class, the one you've all been waiting for, one of our most popular. Everybody wants to sign up for the game design class, so congratulations if you got in. There is a list of people waiting, and probably more people beyond that who just didn't want to join the list because they didn't want to wait for it. My name is Dr. Gurari, pronounced like Ferrari with a G. If we were in person, you'd be in 243, this class at 3:30. There's the Discord and the YouTube, but you already know that. Check out my office hours at your leisure. This would be an in-person course, but hey, we went online, so don't worry about it. And if we do go remote, it might be with little to no notice, as you know. If we are remote, then make sure you show up on Discord, and actually show up on Discord regardless of whether we're remote or not. Office hours posted on Discord, so if you want to contact me during office hours, just make a post in the office hours channel on Discord and I'll get around to you as soon as I can. Here I just made an example of what that would look like. You can post anything you want in there. It just serves as a timestamp that you wanted help, and whenever I'm available, so maybe I'm with somebody in another class or something, I'll DM you and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. So just make a post there, and that basically serves as the cue that you want to do something for office hours. You could also always post your questions in the general chat, but more on that a little bit later. And of course, feel free to email me. Email is at the top of the syllabus there, especially for those more complicated questions. Those code questions gives me a little more time to think about it. Usually turn emails around within a day or so. All right, so this is the important part here, the course description, because I want you to start thinking about what you're going to do and who you're going to do it with. So you're going to create a game in this class using Unity. Some of you are probably going, why Unity? Isn't that a crappy cut rate engine for indie games? And the reason Unity has kind of a strange reputation for some gamers is that it's very accessible, and so it lets people who are relative beginners make at least something. And so sometimes the things that they make aren't very good, and that kind of tarnishes Unity's reputation a little bit, but it's actually a perfectly fine game engine. Lots of great AAA games, or let's say commercially successful and generally well appreciated games are made in Unity. It doesn't have necessarily quite as many features as the game engines that are more expensive, but Unity is free until you reach a certain level of revenue, which is probably the biggest draw of it. All right. So you can either work solo or you can work in a group of up to 4 people. Start thinking about who you might want to work with. There's going to be a crash course in the first couple weeks of the semester where I teach you the most important topics about working with Unity and just basically show you the ropes. But from that point on, what you need to know really diverges based on what kind of game you're making. So it doesn't really make sense for me to just continue lecturing after that. If a lot of people ask questions about something, or I don't know, many people are interested in, for example, particle generation, particle animation, well, I can do a lecture on that. But for the most part, after the first couple weeks, you're going to get all of the class time to work on your project. And instead of lectures, what I'm going to do is, in non-class time, I'm also going to make a video game like you are. So during class time, I'll be available to answer your questions and help you out. Hopefully you have them. But in off time, I'll make a game too, and I'll either live stream it or just upload the video of the entire process. I might not live stream it because people probably aren't too interested, but if there's interest in the live stream, I'm going to do that too. So I'll make a video game as well, and you can kind of follow along with that, and maybe that'll inspire you or show you what to do during yours. But keep in mind that this isn't going to be a lecture-heavy course, so if you came here expecting to just watch PowerPoints or watch me code in Unity and then do like your occasional homework assignment here or there to finish small tasks, that's boring. There's no point in that. That's not what you're going to get. The expectation is that you're going to do a lot of the learning on your own. The expectation is that you're going to ask me a lot of questions. And if you're really not interested in video games, you probably should take some other course because it's going to be very fun for you. Okay, learning outcomes you can read on your own. Same with the CS program goals. Required materials, you don't need anything. And I recommend that if you're going to follow along with Unity tutorials, if you want to get started with learning it, just go directly to the source. Go directly to Unity's learn.unity.com. It's probably the best resource out there for getting started. Most of the books on Unity are outdated by the time that they're published, or they're just not very good. Most of the YouTube videos on Unity are just awful. Blog posts and forum stuff is pretty hit or miss. You kind of have to know what you're doing to be able to rate the quality of it, which is dangerous. So just go to Unity's website directly. You're going to need a pretty good computer to run Unity. This is a big caveat. So if you don't have a pretty good computer, and this counts for you Mac people too, your poor little Mac that costs $3,000 is going to whine and spin the fans up when it has to run Unity. It just will happen. Luckily, the newer versions, they support those fancy M1 chips, so if you've got the newest Mac, you should still be good. But really, you have to have a decent computer. So if you don't have one, let me know as soon as possible, and hopefully IT can still hook you up with one. But yeah, you're going to need at least like 8 gigs of RAM at the minimum. You should probably have 16. You're going to need at least a dedicated graphics card. You can maybe get away with a relatively modern processor that has integrated graphics, but still, it's going to be a challenge. Yeah, Unity, you have to run it alongside with Visual Studio, which is notorious for its resource intenseness, and yeah, have a good computer. The other thing is, if you're planning to do this whole class on your laptop, and it's like a 13-incher or a 15-incher or something, you're going to have a really bad time. Unity is this enormous screen with lots and lots of subscreens, and you need all of them. So make sure you have a second monitor. Does that mean that you can't work in class without bringing your second monitor with you in a briefcase? Probably not, but just don't expect to be at your maximum productivity unless you have a larger screen or a second monitor. If you do, you'll be good to go. So you don't need a tremendous computer, and you don't need a tremendous setup, but you need a decent one. I also recommend having a controller. I mean, come on, it's 2022, mouse and keyboard gaming is well on its way out. Sorry, PC gamers. But hey, you're free to make a mouse and keyboard game too if you want. So the course project spans pretty much the whole semester. It makes up the entirety of your grade. What you're going to want to do today and in the next few days, because it's due pretty soon, is come up with an idea for a game. So I say first few week here, but I don't know, that was probably a typo. I mean soon. I'm going to vet your ideas to make sure that they're feasible, but there's really no limit to what you can do in terms of what kinds of games you can make and the level of complexity. Anything's fine. It has to be complex enough, but at the same time also looking for stuff that's not too easy, obviously. And you don't have to finish what you start. You can completely change your mind. You can pivot to something different as long as you finish something. But if you're pivoting on like week 12 or something, you're going to have a bad time. So really and concretely make up your mind and commit to it within the first few weeks. Little pivots like, oh, I want to do something slightly different. And that's okay. If you want to do a VR game, yeah, absolutely. Just my one rule for VR games would be that it has to be Vive compatible, because that's what I have. I'm not going to run out and buy an Oculus for you. All right. So again, you can opt to work alone or with a small team, but, and here's a really interesting bit, if you want to work with other people, you can join up with them and then you can disconnect from them at any time. You don't necessarily have to deliver the finished product together. Okay, so you can, let's say you and some of your friends, you want to build an FPS. Okay, so you can join up with them and you can build the bare bones foundations of an FPS before you get to the art or anything, and then you can say, well, mine's going to be cat-based and yours is going to be dog-based, so I think we should go our separate ways here. And then you can keep going with cat-based FPS, they can go dog-based FPS. Awesome, you know, that's perfectly fine. You might even choose to build different things for different teams, so maybe you have like a common menu system that maybe the FPS team uses, but also the platforming teams or something, they share a similar menu. The only thing that I ask is that you inform me when you fork off from your team so that I know who's working on what, and I can kind of get an idea of how much of the stuff that you've done on your own. If you do opt to work as a team, you have to keep track of who did what and who's responsible for what. So make sure that you're taking credit for everything that you do when you're working in a team. Generally, the easiest way to take credit is just to mark the method that you work on, the class, whatever, with @author, and just put your name there. Put the date, maybe, if you want to get fancy with it. But you will be expected to keep track of who did what. And if you have something that two people are taking credit for, it's definitely going to be an issue. And if there's something in the code that nobody took credit for, I'll just give credit to nobody for completing it. Probably the most important thing to note is that you don't have the whole 16 weeks to finish the core gameplay. So this is something that I learned from trying to do that mobile development class last semester for the small number of people who are in that. Way less interest than in games, huh? So you give people 16 weeks to do something and they do it on week 15, right? No, people tend to focus on their little details and stuff and get bogged down in it. So here I'm going to enforce that you have to do your core gameplay first, and then you have to have an actual playable and functioning game done by the week before spring break. That's March 16th. That sounds pretty far away. That's basically 2 whole months minus 3 days, but that's pretty close, isn't it? At that point, you have to have a fully playable demo of your game. And the only way that you're going to be able to finish that is if you prioritize doing your core features and your core gameplay. Then the rest of the semester, you're allowed to work on your graphics, your level design, your storyboarding, whatever it is that you want to do. But first, actually get it playable, and then you can start working on the details. Now, there are some exceptions. If you work with a team, you can assign somebody to be maybe the visual effects person, and then that person can get started on art before, but we'll talk more about that later. So there will be project checkpoints on Canvas. Just make sure you read those carefully. Only one person per team has to submit, and just follow the instructions that you're given there. The checkpoint expectations are here. Basically, at different points in the semester, I'm expecting different things to happen. By the 23rd of February, so in about 1 month, you should have something that's playable, glitchy, but playable maybe. By the 16th, you're done with all your core gameplay. So essentially finished on the 16th. And 26th, you have to have your plan ready for me. So that's, you got 7 days here. All right. So in the first 2 weeks, again, lectures, I'm going to do a game alongside you. I'll either upload the videos or live stream it, etc. There's no exams here. There's no grade for attendance. I will expect you to be in Discord. If you're not present and I don't see you working either in class or in Discord, it will reflect badly on you when it comes time for the checkpoints if you don't deliver. But otherwise, you don't necessarily have to be in class. You know, if you have to miss class for whatever reason, sure, but you know, keep in mind the university has an attendance policy and et cetera, et cetera. And the expectation here is not that you're just doing the 2 hours a week in class and that's it. The expectation is that you're working those additional 3 to 6 hours a week outside of class. A lot of people are very interested in game development. You're going to be competing with a class of people who are working pretty hard at their game and are trying to build a finished product. So, you know, plan accordingly. If you're really uninterested and you don't plan to do at least a few hours each week outside of class, you're probably not going to do well. Now, if somebody's freeloading, just kick them off your team. Remember, you can fork off or remove people from your team at will. So just, if somebody's not doing their fair share, just stop working with them. That's it. Your final grade is based on the checkpoints, then peer review and testing, which is you playing somebody else's game towards the end of the semester and giving them constructive feedback so that they can make some final improvements. And then, of course, the vast majority of your grade is based on the finished project, where the criteria are that it's functional, that it's useful, technically sound. You can read through what all of that means, but that won't be important to you for another 16 weeks. Just forget about it. Make a good game. All right. Calendar, you got your checkpoints on the calendar. Great. Another thing that's cool to point out is that I'm going to set aside some money once we get past the point when you're supposed to have your core gameplay done to buy art and 3D assets and stuff for you. If you really want like programming packages and stuff, you can pick those up too, but those are really for noobs, so hopefully we won't need too many of those. But some of them are fun, like menu managers and things like that. So if you're not done with your menus by week 8, that's fine. Those aren't important, for example, and maybe you want like a menu management package, sure. So we're going to kind of buy these assets as a class. Obviously, I'm paying, but you know, once the class can vote after week 8, basically, you can pick which assets you want. Cheaper ones, you know, $5, $10, $15, $20, $50, whatever. You know, beyond that, probably has to get a few votes for me to bother, but ultimately the assets are owned by me, so if you want to use them commercially, obviously they have restrictions, but you can use them in this class with no penalty. Well, more on that later once we get to the part where you can actually do art. And then by continuing with this course, you agree to the license agreement here that, et cetera, you can read it, but basically if you make more than $100,000 a year, you owe a portion of your revenue to anybody that helped you. Okay, well, if you make $100,000 a year, congrats. Just for the sake of having a license agreement. Now, a little bit different, obviously, for the cheating policy this time, as I insinuated already, you can share with others, so let's just be really specific about it. You can use anything that you find on the internet that's free of copyright and legal restrictions. You have to share the license if that's required for licensing purposes. But other than that, you don't have to credit where you got something. So if you want to import libraries or art assets or other stuff, as long as it's not pirated and it's generally free, okay, go ahead, use it. So basically, a very open internet policy here. Remember that some things are only free for students, so avoid things that are only free for students. Use things that are free for everybody. It's also true of Unity itself. There's a student version, and there's the regular version. If you actually want to deploy your game commercially, use the regular version. If you don't, then student version's fine. It's basically the pro version with no commercial license, so you can't sell any of the stuff you make with it. They recently, in I think 2020 or maybe even 2021, finally enabled the dark skin for free users. That was the #1 cause of Unity piracy. No one cared about any of the pro features except the dark skin. But now you finally don't have to anymore. You can just use the regular version and you get the dark skin for free. Okay, obviously you can't contract a third party. Duh. And you have to accurately attribute all the contributions that everybody does. So taking credit for somebody else's work or giving somebody else credit for yours, that can still lead to a failing grade. Sharing code between teams. All right, you can share anything that you want with other teams. That includes your code. And you can implement code that other teams have shared with you. The only restriction is that you, again, have to accurately attribute anything that you took from other teams. You can't take credit for their work or give another group credit for yours. But otherwise, share as much as you want. And the final project, the thing that you complete at the end of the semester, that should at least be mostly your own, at least majority. So at least 75% of the content should be written by you. Okay, well, everything else you can read at your leisure, the lovely bias and harassment statement and whatnot. Let's get to some slides. Let's get to some fun slides. Some of this is going to be a repeat, but we'll go into more detail. And then after we're done with these slides, we'll go to Discord and talk to each other, everyone's worst fear. Okay, so again, what are we doing here? We're going to make a game. I'm barely going to lecture you, if at all. Class time is for making games. Now, who am I? Okay, Dr. Gurari again. And I've been making games for a long time. Like, in one form or another, I've been making games for 15 years. I haven't really released anything outside of a couple mods. I mostly just make games for fun. Things to play with my friends, things to play by myself, etc. So I can make games, haven't really released them commercially, but I have a ton of experience with this, I'm doing it forever. And I've been working with Unity since like 2014. And I've worked with VR since like the Oculus Dev Kit. So I've been doing all this forever. In my experience, all the tutorials and videos out there are pretty much a waste of time. The only way you learn is by doing. So that's kind of why I made the decision not to really lecture in this class, because all the time I spent listening to directions and reading directions and watching those tutorials, more or less wasted. The only good tutorials are the ones that force you to follow along and do this stuff. Those can be pretty helpful, but even those aren't as good as just getting in there and doing it yourself. And the reason that that's so effective in Unity compared to in other ecosystems is because Unity's documentation is amazing. Their first-party documentation, like all their API docs and everything that comes from Unity, is really, really solid. And so going to third parties is just less effective than getting it directly from Unity. There's also a lot of stuff there's dozens of ways to do it, and there's no necessarily right way. The only way you learn which way is right for your application is by trying it a few different ways and figuring it out. And since it's such a visual medium, it's easy to try it a few different ways and see which one works better. And you'll see what I mean when you start trying to do things with the physics engine. That there's a ton of ways to move a thing from point A to point B, but you might make lag. It might look funny when it moves. It might not animate well. It might have other limitations. You're going to end up trying it a lot of different ways. So use me as a resource because I've seen a ton of different things. If you have something and you're struggling to decide what's the best way to do it, or you want to get some guidance on what would be the best way to get started, I'll point you in the right direction. But if you don't ask me questions and don't use me as a resource, you paid good money to be here. Joke's on you at that point, I guess. So I would strongly encourage you to bother me when you can and post all the questions that you want. So a lot of you are probably thinking, I'm going to go solo because I hate people. And that would be disappointing because there's like 30 of you, and that's a lot of games. So to group or not to group, let's think about it. First, collaborating in Unity is pretty bad. Unity has made a couple of attempts at it. They've had these different Unity collab platforms over the years. None of them have been great. Synchronizing your code with an outside VCS like GitHub has never really worked because Unity has a bunch of these temp files. You can kind of do it with your scripts, but then Unity's a little wonky about reloading them. It's kind of hard to work with others in Unity. To be honest, the software support for it is not great. But it's also not that bad because you can switch who's responsible for what, work in different parts. You can really compartmentalize what you do and then come together and combine it. So it's not terrible. It is pretty hard to communicate ideas in terms of game development, but again, not a big deal. You can compartmentalize. The most important thing is probably differences of visions. You want to make something that nobody else wants to make. Well, guys, there's not that many kinds of games out there. Everything is kind of derivative, right? So just find the people who are making the thing that's closest to what you're making. Find what you have in common and make that bit together. All right. There's no need for 10 different people to make a platformer from scratch or 10 different people to make an FPS from scratch. There just isn't. So share workload, don't reinvent the wheel. In this class, you should be sharing your code with everybody. I know that's unusual, but you should set up a Git, put the code up on GitHub somewhere, make sure everybody can access your scripts easily, share what you think is cool, share the interesting discoveries that you made. You can group up and split off with people as often as you like. As I mentioned earlier, maybe you want to build a menu together, but the rest of the game you want to go alone. Fine. Okay, there's really no reason for us to make 30 different menus. Okay, there should be like one settings menu that the whole class uses essentially. Maybe a few for different games, but probably just based off of one foundational settings menu. Maybe you'll even just copy the one I use. Perfectly fine. Maybe I'll copy yours. Also perfectly fine. Let's say that you lack skill though. Let's say that you got to this point in the CS program by your charm and good looks alone, and you don't actually know any computer science. It's possible. But no, seriously, let's say that you don't feel very confident in your computer science skill. Well, then you should definitely group up, because there's still tons of ways to contribute in game development. There's tons of boring minutia and stuff. Just be upfront and indicate that you're going to play second fiddle and let somebody else take kind of the leadership position and, you know, figure out what you actually can do and contribute in your own way. So especially if you feel like you're not ready to build a game individually, go find somebody else and help them with their vision. Why fly solo then? Okay, well, let's say you have a very particular vision about what you want, or people just frighten you. If people frighten you, you should probably work on that, because there's going to be a lot of people out there, and working solo is not really sustainable for your career. It can be easier to code alone, because, again, the tooling's not great, and integrating code between different people is kind of hard. It can be harder than starting over, or vice versa. Someone asked if I want to join their dev group, and the answer is no. I always go solo, because people scare me. Ask yourself this, though. Do you like games? Either playing them or making them. Those are two different things. I like playing games and making games. Some people only like playing them. Actually, most people only like playing them. So think about if you like games at all, at least playing them. Because if you don't, then this is going to be a really tiresome course for you. You're not going to enjoy it. But if you do, again, keep in mind that just because you like playing them doesn't necessarily mean you're going to like making them. It might, but it doesn't guarantee it. I'd say it's probably like 25% maybe less actually enjoy making games who enjoy playing them. This is a low-risk environment for you to figure that out. So if you at least enjoy playing them, then by all means give it a go and figure out if you also enjoy making them. So some professional advice for you here is going to come very harsh to some of you. It's going to really kill the dream. Okay, do you want to work in the games industry? Do you want to join Microsoft, the only game company there will be by the time you graduate? It'll be just Microsoft and Sony, the only two companies in existence. So, do you want to join Microsoft's games? Well, don't. Just really don't do it. And I've known people who worked at Blizzard, for example. Don't do it. It's a terrible place. I'm not disparaging them publicly or whatever, but don't do it. You're probably saying, but I really want to. No, just don't do it. If you really, really want to work in the games industry, then my recommendation to you is to become financially independent by getting a regular software job, and then work on games as an indie developer. So seriously, I warned you, don't do it. But okay, fine. So I haven't convinced you. Why not? Why not work in the games industry if it's your dream? Because the salaries in the game industry are awful. That's a start. Like, they're not even really software developer salaries. Like, they're half or lower than what other software developers make. And that's accounting for the fact that game developers typically have to live in very specific parts of the country. Like, it's going to be difficult to find a game development job if you want to stay in Cleveland, for example. Not really a ton of game companies out here. Actually, are a couple, but they're small studios and they make like gambling games and things. But yeah, you're going to have to move probably for a start, and you're going to get paid poorly, even relative to software engineers on a national scale, but especially poorly relative to the kinds of places where the game studios tend to be, high cost of living areas like California and Vancouver. So unless you want to move to like, I don't know, Eastern Europe, you're not going to have a great salary relative to the place where you're working. And the working conditions, ooh, they're just like historically terrible. It's always on the news, right? How bad it is. Terrible hours in addition to the terrible pay, so your hourly wage comes out to Cracker Jacks. By the way, that's if they even pay you. In many instances, your paycheck just vanishes, no notice, termination, no notice, hey, the company folded up. One of my favorite games, Gigantic, like in the chat if you ever played Gigantic. They at one point ran out of money. Everybody worked for like 3 months unpaid, right? And then they finally got a new investor. Lasted another year, then basically folded overnight and just laid everybody off. Yeah, it happens all the time. It's basically constant in the industry. Whole studios fold overnight. You know, behind the scenes of big acquisitions like Microsoft picking up Blizzard, once it's closed and all the media attention dies down, there'll probably be a lot of layoffs. People that just vanish. It's especially true when big studios like EA acquire the little studios of developers. It's really the publishers have most of the control in the industry because there's such a surplus of developers. So the burnout's high, turnover is constant, job security is low, the work culture is bad, toxic, just mean. People want you to do crunch all the time. There's emphasis on your job being your life, etc., etc. And then also, at the end of the day, the game you're working on isn't yours. It's part of a whole team. And you might end up making a commercial flop. In fact, if you just go to Steam or something and pick a game at random, you've probably never heard of it. It probably has barely any reviews, and it probably made barely any money. The vast majority of games are played by almost nobody. And even AAA titles, a pretty significant number of them end up dying in obscurity. Well-deserved obscurity, because most games are terrible if you really objectively look at it. And that's pretty disappointing when you're a developer. That's true of software, too. Most software is terrible, but somehow it's just not as disappointing when it's, you know, a website or something. Okay, so why take this class if you don't want to work in the games industry? Well, you like games. Yeah, you want to make a finished product for your portfolio. This is really helpful if you don't already have a job lined up. Having something built that you can actually show off is awesome. Video game development is really unique, so you'll learn a lot of cool tricks. It really helps to click you into the object-oriented programming paradigm. It can also help you click into the functional programming paradigm. Depends on the way you think, but it revolves around a lot of the kind of functional transformation of numbers into other numbers, and also that object-oriented hierarchy of objects talking to one another stuff. Both of those things may very well click for you for the first time in the computer science program, but not to lie to you, most of the skills don't translate very well to other kinds of software development. It's great, the stuff in chat, commercial flops. So, all right, let's go make some games. Let's talk about making games now. Enough being depressing. Let's talk game stuff. Game plan for making your game. Some of the first things that you're going to have to think about if you haven't thought about them already. All right, do's and don'ts. Should have showed this slide before I said what I said. Okay. So let's talk about what you might make and what you definitely shouldn't make. In approximate order, my opinion, and this isn't necessarily gospel, and you could definitely make a game in one of these genres that's easier or harder depending on the features that you've added to it, but roughly, in my opinion, by genre, how difficult it is to make a game. So the games that I'm not going to let you make because they're just too easy are obviously point-and-click games, idle games, gal games, stuff where you just point and click and one thing happens and that's it. No, can't do those. And really simple puzzles like tic-tac-toe or Connect 4 or checkers or something, forget it. It's been rehashed. We did checkers in one homework assignment in the intro class or the intermediate, 129 anyway, so no, it's too easy. The easiest genres are platformers for sure. Platformers are dead easy. Most people who have any experience in game development can knock out a platformer in an afternoon, just from the programming perspective. Likewise, FPS is really easy. Racing is kind of, it depends. Like racing games, depends on how finicky you are about the physics and everything. But to make a funny racing game, I use the example actually of something like Goat Simulator, which is kind of a racing game, but there's no actual racing. It's like a physics simulation game, really. But that's super simple to put together. So if you don't care too much about your physics, racing games are pretty easy. And if you do care about your physics, still not so bad. So those are the easiest genres. Moderately hard, you wouldn't expect it, but turn-based games are actually really difficult to nail. So turn-based games are probably on the harder end of moderate. So if you wanted to make something like Civilization, that would be like super difficult. But if you wanted to make simpler turn-based games like, say like, I don't know, Mechanicus or something, that's not so bad. You could probably do that. So turn-based strategy, relatively challenging, and that's only because there are so many different elements to work out, there's so much math behind it, and there's a ton of planning. You usually have a lot of different features. So if you keep it minimalistic, like Advanced Wars or something, then you'll probably be fine. Most role-playing games are difficult for the same reason. They usually have very straightforward physics and combat and that kind of thing, but then they have all these different elements you have to factor in. So again, if you keep it simple, you don't try to make The Witcher or something, you can pull off an RPG for sure. Card games, again, hard for the same reason, lots of math, lots of different considerations and edge cases to think of. Something like Slay the Spire is really complex if you just think about how many different cards are available in a game like that and how they all interact with each other and how you have to handle all the different edge cases between those interactions. But if, again, you can keep it relatively simple and limit your card pool so that you don't have hundreds, you just have maybe dozens, you probably pull it off. Uno, too easy. Roguelikes, not bad. Pretty easy to do. And any kind of action combat game, also not bad. Fairly easy. So by action combat, I mean like a fighting game where you run around, usually with RPG elements, something like God of War or something, those aren't too bad either. Any kind of climbing / action game, something like Assassin's Creed, that gets a little bit more challenging because you have more complex physics interactions, but just basic like hack and slash is pretty straightforward. Basically just like a slightly harder twist on an FPS at that point. The games that are really challenging to make and that you should only take on if you're very interested in those genres are real-time strategy. You might have noticed that there hasn't been a AAA real-time strategy game released since StarCraft 2, which was like 2008 or something, and don't tell me Age of Empires 3, I don't want to hear it. Okay, but okay, Age of Empires 3, or is it 4? I think it's 4. We just forget 3 existed. Age of Empires 4 is probably the first one since StarCraft 2, so you can see how complicated that genre is based on the fact that the AAA studios don't even touch it. World-building RPGs like Minecraft are also really difficult, but there's some exceptions to that. If you really just want to be able to put blocks down or basically put things in the environment at random and then have physics interact with them, something like VR chat, that's really easy. It's not really true world building. But if you want to be like Minecraft where things actually like stick together and become structures, that's really difficult. So plan accordingly if you're trying to do that. All right, so things to do, single player. couch co-op. I highly recommend couch co-op because there's a real dearth of couch co-op games out there. Everybody wants to play over the internet or play by themselves. Really hard to find split-screen co-op these days. Mac, PC, or mobile, if you want, maybe even Linux. Unity is very easy to go cross-platform. So as long as you support the universal Unity control scheme, it might actually be as simple as just checking a box. Somebody brought up something like Smash Brothers. That'd be like an action or a fighting game. It's probably in the moderate category. You can do controller or you can do mouse and keyboard, just don't do like a weird input device, basically. I recommend that if you have some kind of narrative or story, you keep it relatively short, and I recommend, again, that you keep your gameplay pretty basic. You can add complexity after you're done with it, basically. So don't do something on any of the consoles just because I don't want to have to go get a console to test your game, and likewise for everyone in the class that has to test your game, especially since they're all out of stock anyway. It's not like you can get one. Don't use weird input devices like racing controllers or something. You can use the Vive sticks and the Vive fancy curve doodads if you want, but don't do anything beyond that. So keep it to Xbox or PlayStation controller, mouse and keyboard, another universal PC controller if you want. No weird steering wheels and gas pedal setups. Avoid large-scale story narratives because it's not really the point of the class for you to create like a very long point-and-click story, but the only actual gameplay element of it is your character just wanders the world and presses A to talk to people. That's not really very interesting. So focus on the game and the gameplay rather than the narrative. It's not that you can't have a narrative, you certainly can, but it can't be the whole central purpose of your project. Avoid having multiple game modes. Again, just do one thing and do it well. And don't lean too heavily on your art assets. This is what all the AAA studios do. Like, if you look at Call of Duty or something, it only has like 6 programmers. That's all they need. It's essentially just the same game with art assets upon art assets piled on it, and animations and all that good stuff, cutscenes. And don't do that. You're primarily here to learn computer science. And things you absolutely can't do: no multiplayer, online multiplayer, or LAN multiplayer. Multiplayer is incredibly complicated. You really have to build your game with multiplayer in mind from the ground up. You have to have a tremendous amount of experience. I think you have to build up a tremendous amount of experience with single player first. So only if you can show me certified proof that you are a genius can you endeavor to do multiplayer with networking. No mods of existing games. You can't make Stardew Valley mod as your project. Boring. And you can't make a direct remake. So you can't just say, I'm going to make Uno, or I'm going to make chess. It's got to have a twist. It's no fun if you just make a remake of something that already exists. Like if you just make a frame-for-frame Mario, it's been done. No fun. Alright, let's talk about video game stuff now, because this is also important to the kind of game you're going to design. So have these thoughts in your mind when you're thinking about the properties of your game and how it's going to work and play and different features. Okay, so the first thing that people who aren't familiar with game design don't realize is that there's soft bodies and hard bodies in physics. Alright, and I'm not talking about this kind of distinction. Okay, I'm talking about soft bodies. Soft bodies are anything that deforms when it makes contact with something else. So cloth, hair, soft surfaces. Whenever they hit something hard, they deform. Okay, what happens? And it deforms. The only exception is terrain, so like the ground that you walk on and actual parts of the terrain and the environment. Those you actually can make deform without making them soft bodies. There's some exceptions there, so terrain damage, kind of leaving behind craters, that kind of thing, it's technically not as hard, but soft body collision between things made of cloth and things that are not completely rigid. That's really challenging. So if you work very hard and you dedicate a lot of time and energy to it, you might have one or two soft bodies in your whole game, but you'll probably have none. And you might be thinking, well, how come so many games have like, I don't know, like a weird slime character that seems like they ooze around? Well, it's all animation. The actual body of that object is not soft. So if you look at, for example, the cape physics in your game of choice or the hair physics in your game of choice, sometimes those are soft body collision, but most of the time those are just a pre-rendered animation that kind of points in a particular direction. That, again, you might be able to do, but that more depends on the art asset you pick up, whether it's going to support that. So there are relatively few exceptions to this, but just keep in mind that if your game is like objects collide and then they deform or change in some way, that's probably not going to be possible unless those objects are completely rigid. So don't expect things to flex. So this is a weird limitation again, because you wouldn't think it'd be that difficult, but it is. All right. So hard bodies, which is what Unity primarily deals with when it's simulating physics, don't deform when they're hit. When a hard body strikes another hard body, it can bounce off, it can be destroyed, it can splinter into a bunch of new hard bodies, so you can destroy it, then create new ones. It can trigger any kind of effect like that. You could play an animation, explosion, whatever. It can also transfer force, physics simulation, right? So one thing hits another thing, bang, and the other thing goes flying away, or vice versa, or the thing gets destroyed, or the thing bounces off. Those are all hard body collisions. And those are the foundation of game building. So your character, the weapons, the bullets, anything that you're going to make, those are all going to be hard bodies. All right, what about art in general? Okay, well, let's worry about art later. In fact, during the first 6 to 8 weeks of the semester, until you have your core gameplay done, and I've signed off on it, you are banned from doing any production-ready artwork. You can just use placeholder assets. You don't even look at real assets. If I see you making things too pretty, I'll yell at you. Make sure that you're not thinking about art until you've nailed the core gameplay. The only exception is that if you've decided to team up and somebody on your team is responsible for particle effects, your art, that's like their job. They're a dedicated VFX person. And that's a particularly good thing to do if maybe you are one of those less skilled programmers. You know, the VFX and stuff takes less programming ability, but it's a lot more art and, let's be honest, minutia intensive. You have to do a lot of very tiny tweaking to get it to look good. It's time consuming. You know, maybe that's a good role for you. Just think about that. Some early decisions you're going to have to make. So first, which version of Unity to use. We're going to use either the latest 2021 or the latest 2020. Don't use 2022. It's still being released in different versions, and I want to make sure we all have the same version because it's annoying to open projects from different Unity versions. So use either 2021 2.7 or 2023 2.5. You can pull those from the archive. Don't use 2022. You have to pick the render pipeline when you make a project. You're probably going to use the default unless you have a really compelling reason not to. It's hard to find art assets that support the high definition render pipeline, and you're probably not going to get to the point where you script different lighting and shading effects. Unity's defaults are pretty decent looking, and it's really a pain in the butt to use the others. So for the most part, unless you really, really want to, use the standard rendering pipeline. So 2D or 3D, again, that's something that you're going to have to do right at the beginning, because when you start a Unity project, it asks you, do you want a 2D or a 3D project? You would think that making a 2D game is easier, but it's really about the same. And the only real difference is that sometimes it's easier to find 2D art because more people can draw in 2D, obviously. Sprite art is easier to find. But even if your game is kind of flat in the way that you play it, so even if you're making, let's say, a platformer and you can only move in one dimension, you probably want things to be like further or closer to the field of view at different points in gameplay. So you might want to make a 3D project anyway. Almost all of the time I recommend going with a 3D project, unless your game is very distinctly two-dimensional, it's some kind of puzzle, or something like that. Almost all of you should probably make a 3D game. So sprites, sprite-based games, those are probably going to be 2D. That's maybe the only exception. Sprite-based games include games where the camera has the optical illusion where it appears to be from above, but actually the whole world is just flat and all the different art things are at an angle. So bear in mind that is a 2D game too. So something like Terraria is obviously completely two-dimensional, but then anything that is like isometric camera as well, probably two-dimensional too. Beyond that, probably go with 3D. You'll have to decide pretty early on if you want to have a game where the camera moves or the camera doesn't. Pretty straightforward. Like, all right, most RPGs, most action games, the camera is controlled manually. So one stick controls the character, one stick controls the camera, or the mouse controls the camera, the keyboard controls the character, something like that, right? So manual camera is a little bit easier to do than automatic camera. An automatic following camera that's good is kind of challenging. The exception is like a first-person shooter or something where, again, you've got the mouse that just controls the angle that the camera faces, and the camera is obviously attached to your head and follows you wherever you go. So auto camera, pretty difficult. Manual camera, a little easier. Fixed camera, obviously not every game supports fixed camera, but if you have a game where the camera can be fixed in place, sure. But then you probably have to change scenes and move it around at different times anyway. Having a camera fixed in one place probably isn't going to be, very interesting. And when I say camera, I mean the actual field of view that the person sees when they're playing a game, to be clear. You get to choose whether the main character needs to be affected by physics. So most first-person shooters, they don't, right? You bump into walls and nothing happens, basically, except that you stop. You can jump, so you're affected by gravity, and that's about it. Most FPS games use a character controller to move around. Many platformers or action games will use a rigid body instead. That's affected by actual physics. To get it to move, you have to apply force to it and accelerate it. If it strikes another object, it can be deflected and fly away. A lot of games, RPGs, will pull off. They'll use a character controller to move around most of the time, and then if you get hit by something that should throw you, your character briefly becomes a rigid body until they hit the ground, and then you recover movement again. That's the most complicated, that you have both. They're about the same difficulty to implement, but rigid bodies, they don't move as naturally because they're getting affected by weird forces, and you can't really simulate something like walking very well by just applying a steady force. It's pretty hard to do. Whereas if it's a character controller, well, you can't just get deflected by an explosion or something and fly away. So think about it some more. If you want any more details, then tell me kind of what you're thinking about, and I'll let you know which one I think that you should probably lean towards. All right, so today's task, go into Discord, come up with an idea, talk to at least 5 other people. I recommend that unless you have a very particular idea in mind already, you start in the general chat, and then we'll filter down into groups as you get more coherent ideas and find people who have like interest to you. But talk to at least 5 other people, figure out what they want to do, write down their name, write down your impression of their idea, and give them at least one item of written critical feedback about their idea. So whether you think it's good or bad, don't just say it's good, say why, and don't just say it's bad, say why. And obviously, try to group up, make some friends. I do not want 30 different teams here this semester. Okay, that's it for me, I think. Yeah, last slide. Yep, okay. So see you in Discord, and I have to make some more voice chats because there's so many people. All right, adios.